Whispers spread like wildfire through the marble halls that night. A royal wedding, celebrated by thousands, was supposed to end in triumph, but instead it collapsed into shame. When the king's young bride soiled herself on their wedding night, the scandal rippled beyond the bedchamber, staining not only her dignity, but the fragile unity of a kingdom. Few understood the cruelty that followed, or how this single moment would twist into a story of betrayal, power, and hidden truth. What began as humiliation would end as revelation, one that no court poet dared to write. But history refused to forget. The kingdom of Avaris stood at the edge of both greatness and ruin. Its towers pierced the sky, its marketplaces overflowed with color and sound, and its armies marched in disciplined lines that shook the earth beneath their boots. But beneath the polished marble and gilded banners, rot spread quietly. Famine had carved hollow bellies in the villages. Nobles schemed for power behind the king's back. The people's loyalty, once unshakable, waned with every passing season. King Alaric, though feared and respected, understood that his throne was fragile. He was a man hardened by years of war, crowned not by destiny, but by bloodshed. To his council, he appeared unshaken. Yet in the silence of his chambers, he wrestled with the knowledge that the kingdom's fractures threatened to undo all he had built. It was his advisors who suggested the marriage. Across the border lay the realm of Doria, a land equally battered by war. For generations, Avaris and Doria had been enemies, locked in cycles of conquest and reprisal. But exhaustion had softened old hatreds, and both thrones understood that peace was cheaper than war. A union, they said, could mend wounds that armies never could. Thus the name of Princess Elenia was spoken in the council chamber. She was the youngest daughter of Doria's ruling house, barely 17, untested, unproven, yet valuable as a symbol. To the lords of Avaris, her worth was not in her mind or her heart, but in her body one that could bear heirs, and with them, stability. For Elenia, the decision came without choice. One morning, she was summoned to her mother's chambers and told she would soon be a queen. She remembered the way her mother's hands shook as she adjusted her veil, the sorrow buried behind her words of congratulations. Elenia understood then that her life was no longer her own. She was to become the seam in a fraying tapestry, stitched between two kingdoms, whether she wished it or not. The weeks leading to the wedding were filled with rituals meant to transform her from daughter into bride. She was bathed in waters, scented with crushed herbs, her skin scrubbed until it glowed. She fasted to purify herself, her meals replaced by draughts of bitter teas, said to prepare a woman for her husband's touch. Tutors whispered lessons into her ears, how to walk with grace, how to bow with humility, how to smile without revealing fear. But no ritual could soothe the dread that coiled inside her. Each morning, as the palace maids bound her in silks too heavy for her slender frame, she felt more like a sacrifice than a bride. At night, when sleep eluded her, she remembered the stories of queens past women celebrated in songs, yet broken in silence. She wondered if she would join their ranks, a name gilded in history, but hollowed in truth. The day of the wedding arrived with thunderous celebration. The streets of Avaris swelled with people, their hunger for bread momentarily replaced by hunger for spectacle. Banners of gold and crimson fluttered in the wind, choirs filled the air with hymns, and nobles draped in jewels paraded through the palace gates. For the people, this union was not merely political, it was hope. However fragile, that peace might finally silence the drums of war. Elenia, veiled and adorned, moved like a figure carved from marble. Her gown shimmered with pearls, her crown pressed heavy against her temples. To the onlookers, she was radiant. To herself, she was numb. As she walked down the aisle of the grand cathedral, her hands trembled beneath her gloves, hidden from view. King Alaric waited at the altar, his frame towering, his eyes sharp as steel. He was older than she, a man whose life had been measured in battles won and enemies buried. When their eyes met, she did not see warmth. She saw calculation, the gaze of a ruler weighing not a woman, but a bargain. The ceremony passed in a blur of vows and blessings. Priests invoked the gods, nobles offered their cheers, and at last, the golden rings bound their fates together. When the final words were spoken, the cathedral erupted in triumph. Trumpets blared, bells tolled, and the people outside roared as though salvation had been delivered. But Elenya felt none of it. As the king took her hand and led her from the altar, her stomach twisted. The fasting, the tease, the exhaustion of endless preparations, all of it churned inside her like a storm. Still, she smiled, for that was what was demanded of her. The wedding feast lasted until dusk. Tables bent under the weight of roasted meats, golden breads, and jeweled wines. Nobles toasted the union with voices that grew louder with every cup, while minstrels strummed songs of victory and peace. Elenya sat beside the king, untouched plates before her, her body too weak to consume the food she so desperately needed. She raised her goblet when required, forced her lips into polite smiles, and endured the eyes that studied her every movement. At last, as torches flickered against the darkening sky, the king rose. His hand gripped hers with a firmness that brooked no hesitation. The hall fell into silence as the couple departed, every gaze following them to the doors that led toward the royal chambers. For the people, the night ahead symbolized the true beginning of peace. For Elenya, it felt like walking into a cage. The doors shut behind them with a heavy thud. The cheering of the feast faded into silence. In the dim light of the chamber, the weight of expectation pressed harder than ever before. The marriage was not merely a union of two bodies, but of two kingdoms. And every gaze, every hope, every fragile promise rested upon her ability to play the part she had been forced into. She had been told to endure. She had been told to obey. But no one had told her how to bear the breaking of herself. The royal chamber smelled faintly of rosewater and burning incense, yet beneath the perfume lay the suffocating weight of expectation. Heavy curtains sealed the room in shadows, and the great bed draped in crimson silk seemed more an altar than a place of rest. Elenya stood at the threshold, her body trembling beneath the layers of her bridal gown. Her throat felt dry, her stomach knotted tighter with every passing breath. She could hear the muffled cheers still rising from the great hall beyond the stone walls, thousands of voices chanting for unity, for peace, for the consummation that would make this union legitimate. She was no longer a girl, not in their eyes. She was an offering. King Alaric closed the door with a deliberate finality. His presence filled the room, broad shoulders, sharp eyes, movements precise and unyielding. He did not look at her as a husband might look at a bride. He looked at her as a sovereign appraising a prize, measuring whether she would fulfill her role in the great machinery of the realm. "You will change," he said, his voice deep, commanding. Servants rushed forward, their eyes lowered, to unlace the heavy gown from her trembling frame. Piece by piece, the garments of ceremony fell away. Pearls clattered against the floor, gold threads slipped loose, until she stood in only a thin shift, her body pale beneath the candlelight. She shivered, not from cold, but from the crushing weight of Izos of the king. The servants and the unseen multitude who waited beyond these walls for proof of this night's success. When the servants withdrew, silence swelled in the chamber. Alaric approached, his footsteps echoing against the stone. Elenya's heart pounded like a drum in her chest. She fought to steady her breathing, to hold her composure, to be the queen she was demanded to be. But inside her, the storm she had carried all day roared louder. The fasting, the bitter teas, the exhaustion all had stripped her body to its weakest state. As the king touched her shoulder, the knot in her stomach twisted violently. She gasped, her face paling. A sudden cramp seized her, sharp and merciless. She tried to stifle it, to breathe through the pain, but her body refused to obey. A heat spread through her lower belly, followed by the unthinkable. A wetness, sudden and unstoppable. The sound faint but unmistakable. Horror flashed across her face as she realized what had happened. The silk sheets beneath her were stained, the stench rising into the perfumed air. She froze, wishing she could vanish into the shadows, that time itself would halt and erase what had just unfolded. But the king had already stepped back, his eyes wide with shock, then narrowing into disgust. His jaw clenched, his nostrils flared. He was not merely a man humiliated. He was a king whose pride, whose authority, whose very image of control had been shattered in the most intimate of places. "What is this?" His voice was a low growl, venomous. Elenya fell to her knees, her hands shaking. I did not mean." The words caught in her throat, strangled by shame. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. She had endured months of preparation, endless lessons in poise, and now, in a single instant, all had collapsed. Alaric turned away sharply, as if even to look upon her was an offense. He barked for the chamber servants, his tone sharper than steel. They rushed in, gasping as the scene unfolded before them. Their eyes widened, and though they bowed quickly, Elenya saw at the flicker of disbelief, then the shadow of contempt. "Clean this," the king ordered, his voice carrying the weight of fury restrained only by his crown. "No word leaves this room." The servants obeyed, their hands trembling as they stripped the sheets, carried the soiled fabric away, and scrubbed at the floor. Yet secrets in a palace are like water spilled on stone, impossible to contain. Whispers had already begun before the night was over. Elenya curled into herself on the edge of the bed, humiliated beyond words. She wanted to scream, to vanish, to claw her way out of the silks and jewels that now felt like chains. But she could do nothing. She was a bride, a queen, a pawn, and pawns do not control the game. The king said nothing more to her. He left the chamber with heavy strides, slamming the door behind him. Alone in the suffocating silence, Elenya felt her heart splinter. What should have been her first night as queen had become a spectacle of disgrace. By dawn, the whispers were no longer whispers. Chambermaids gossiped as they carried the stained linens to be burned. Guards muttered as they passed one another in the corridors. Nobles, ever hungry for scandal, heard the story before the sun rose. The tale grew with each retelling, the queen unclean, the marriage cursed, the alliance doomed. When Elenya emerged from her chambers the next morning, her face pale, her eyes hollow, she felt the weight of every gaze upon her. Some looked with pity, most with disdain. She walked the marble halls like a ghost draped in jewels. She could feel their laughter even when no one spoke. For the court, her humiliation was not just personal, it was political. A queen who could not control her own body was a sign, they said, that the gods disapproved of the union. A blemish on the alliance, a curse upon the throne. And in a kingdom already fraying, scandal was a weapon sharper than any sword. Elenya's shame was no longer hers alone. It had become a spectacle for the entire realm, a crack in the fragile peace stitched by her marriage. And though she kept her head bowed, inside her a storm gathered, darker than the one that had broken her body. The throne hall glittered with gold, but beneath its brilliance lurked cruelty. Nobles packed the chamber, their jeweled collars gleaming, their whispers cutting through the silence like knives. At the far end, King Alaric sat on his throne, his face carved from stone. At his command, Elenya was brought forth. She walked slowly, her wedding gown replaced by a simple robe of white, a symbol of purity that now mocked her. Every step echoed across the marble floor. She could feel the weight of their stares, some curious, others hungry for spectacle, most already certain of her disgrace. The king's voice thundered. On the night meant to bind our kingdoms, this woman defiled her vows and stained our bed. The gods have shown us their judgment. Gasps rippled through the hall. Some nobles muttered about curses, others about omens. Elenya stood at the center, trembling yet upright. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to bow. For days she had drowned in shame, but now, before the court that sought to crush her, something stirred within her, a quiet flame. She thought of her mother's trembling hands, of the women before her whose stories were erased, of the life stolen from her without consent. If she remained silent, her name would be buried in disgrace. If she spoke, perhaps she would still be buried, but not forgotten. Her voice rang out, clear, though quivering. You call me unclean, yet it was you who starved me for purity, who fed me poisons in the name of preparation. You demanded I be flawless, though my body was broken under your weight. You wed me not for love, not for peace, but for power. And now you would cast me aside for a humiliation you created. The hall froze. Whispers died on tongues. The king's eyes narrowed, rage flickering like fire. "Silence," he roared. But her words had already pierced the silence. Alenya lifted her chin. "If the gods judged me that night, then let them also judge the cruelty that brought me to it. I am not your curse. I am your mirror." Gasps erupted once more, this time sharper, filled with awe as well as horror. Nobles shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes. For the first time, Alaric looked not like an untouchable monarch, but like a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. The moment hung heavy, a knife's edge between defiance and ruin. Alenya's fate was sealed, but her voice had broken the silence that was meant to bury her. The silence in the throne hall was suffocating. Nobles shifted in their seats, their jeweled collars clinking softly as they avoided the queen's gaze. Alenya's words still hung in the air, unshakable, impossible to unhear. King Alaric's jaw clenched, his knuckles white against the armrest of his throne. He had been challenged by a girl, by his bride, by someone he had believed too weak to even lift her head. He could have silenced her with a word. He could have had her dragged from the chamber, beaten, or executed. Yet for the first time his power felt fragile, as though one voice had cracked the stone beneath his crown. He turned his gaze away from her, unwilling to grant her further acknowledgement. "This court has heard enough," he said coldly. "Let it be known that this woman is unfit to be queen. She will be removed from her station and confined to the convent at Vera. There she may repent for her sins." Gasps rippled through the court. Some nodded eagerly, relieved to see order restored. Others looked away, discomfort etched across their faces. They had expected shame, perhaps banishment, but not defiance. The girl who had arrived as a fragile bride had revealed something far more dangerous: truth. Guards stepped forward, their armor clinking as they surrounded Alenya. Yet she did not collapse, did not weep. She lifted her chin, her spine straight. Her eyes swept across the nobles who had mocked her, the courtiers who had whispered about her disgrace. And in their gaze, she saw something she had not seen before: hesitation. The seed had been planted. Alenya was escorted through the palace, past the courtyard still echoing with wedding songs that now tasted of ash. The people lined the streets as word spread of her fall. Some jeered, echoing the king's condemnation, but others, mothers with hollow eyes, servants with worn hands, widows who had lost sons to the king's endless wars, watched her in silence, their gazes heavy with sympathy. For them, Alenya was no longer simply a bride who had failed. She was a mirror of their own humiliation, their own voiceless suffering. Her body had betrayed her under the crushing weight of impossible expectations, just as their lives were broken beneath the weight of royal demands. She had been punished not for her weakness, but for daring to speak the truth of it aloud. The convent at Vera was a cold, stony place, meant to bury women like her in silence. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Yet Alenya's story did not remain behind its walls. Servants who had heard her defiance carried it into the markets. Scribes recorded it in secret journals. Traveling minstrels whispered it into songs, cloaking it in allegory so the king's men could not stamp it out. She was not the cursed bride, they sang. She was the mere bride. The tale spread across avarice. It's carried from taverns to temples, from peasant huts to noble halls. Each retelling shifted, but the essence remained: a young queen humiliated, then silenced, yet daring to speak the truth of power's cruelty. What had begun as scandal became legend, and legend is far more dangerous than rumor. Years later, famine returned to Avaris. The people, already restless, remembered the mere bride. They remembered her words about cruelty, about weight, about broken bodies. Her story became a rallying cry for those who suffered. Mothers whispered it to daughters. Farmers carved it into the handles of their plows. Even soldiers at the edge of rebellion muttered it as they cleaned their swords. King Alaric, once unshakable, found his throne increasingly unstable. He had silenced his queen, but he had not silenced her truth. It lived on, more powerful than his decrees. Alenya herself, cloistered within the convent, never saw the full reach of her defiance. She rose each day to the toll of bells, her hands raw from labor, her prayers whispered into the cold stone walls. Yet even here, she was not forgotten. Pilgrims came in secret, slipping coins to the nuns for a glimpse of the queen who had dared to speak. Some left flowers, others carried away stories of her courage. She did not need a crown. She had become something greater, a symbol. And so, the story endured. Not of a bride who soiled herself in shame, but of a woman who bore humiliation, turned it into truth, and left a scar on the crown itself. The courtiers may have tried to erase her, but history remembers not what kings demand, but what voices refuse to silence. Elena's disgrace became her defiance. Her defiance became her legacy. And her legacy became the reminder that even the most fragile can shake the mightiest throne.